In the winter of 1822, Ashvale Court stood upon its Northumberland ridge like a thing that had forgotten how to be warm. Snow had come early that year, falling in the soft, relentless manner of the north, settling upon the lead roofs and the broken pediments and the long avenue of leafless limes until the whole house seemed to be sinking, slowly and without complaint, into the white. The wind that crossed the moor had teeth in it, and it found every loose casement, every gap in the old mullions, and it moved through the corridors of Ashvale as though it had been given the freedom of the place, sighing in the chimneys and lifting the faded tapestries an inch from the stone before letting them fall again. The house did not resist. It had been resisting for 2 centuries, and it was tired. The frost climbed the inside of the windows in the eastern wing and stayed there past noon, and the great hall, with its blackened beams and its single hour of grey daylight, breathed cold, the way a sleeping animal breathes, slow and deep and indifferent to the small lives moving within it. Into this came Miss Eleanor Voss, 26 years of age, in a travelling gown of dove-grey wool that had been turned once already and would not bear turning again, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and her boots wet through from the inn-yard at Hexham. The carriage that brought her had ground up the avenue with a sound like teeth on gravel, and she had watched the house come into view through a window furred with her own breath, and she had not been afraid. Precisely, for fear was a luxury she had set aside some years ago, but she had felt the old familiar lowering of the spirit that came to her whenever she crossed the threshold of a great house and understood, at once, that she would be neither guest nor family, but something in between, a useful shape in the background, a woman who was paid to be invisible. She was plain. She knew this without bitterness, the way she knew the colour of her own eyes. Her face was long and grave, her hair the brown of a wren's wing, and when she spoke, which was seldom, it was in a low and careful voice that revealed nothing of the 4 languages she carried in her head, or the quickness of the mind behind her steady grey gaze. She had been a governess for 8 years in 3 houses, and she had learned that a clever woman in her position did best to wear her cleverness as she wore her plainness, quietly, and beneath notice. The footman who admitted her did not meet her eye. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Pruitt with a ring of keys at her waist and a manner of perpetual grievance, looked her up and down once and named her chamber, a small room in the eastern wing where the frost did not melt, and remarked that the Duke was not to be disturbed, that the Duke was never to be disturbed, that this was a house in which one learned very quickly to keep to one's allotted rooms. Eleanor said that she understood. She was good at understanding. And as she climbed the cold stair behind the housekeeper's swinging lantern, past portraits of dead Cavendishes whose painted eyes followed her with a particular suspicion of the long dead. She did not yet know the name of the man who owned this freezing place, nor that somewhere beneath its slate and stone there waited a single sheet of paper that would, in time, undo them both. She knew only that she was cold, and that she was tired, and that the house, for all its grandeur, had the smell of a thing slowly closing itself away from the world. The chamber she was given was no warmer than the stair. The fire in its small grate had been laid but not lit, and a thin rime of frost had crept across the lower panes of the single window, etching there the ferns and feathers that the cold draws as when no one is watching. And Eleanor set down her one small trunk and stood a moment in the failing light, with her cloak still about her shoulders, listening to the house. She had served in grand houses before and in mean ones, and she had learned to read them as some women read faces, and this house, she thought, was not unkind. only grieving, the way a person grieves who has shut the curtains and forgotten that the world outside goes on without asking leave. Somewhere above her, in a wing she had not seen, a man she had not met sat alone before a fire that did little against the dark, and grieved as he had grieved for 4 winters, for a wife who would not come back, and the house held its breath around him and waited, as it had waited a long time, for something to change. The morning room faced east, and on her first full day at Ashvale Court, Eleanor found it the only chamber in the house that the cold had not entirely claimed, for the rising sun, pale and brief as it was, came through the tall windows and lay in long stripes across the worn Turkey carpet, and warmed a little the leather of the books. It was here that she had been set to work, for the task that had brought her north was not, after all, the schooling of a child, or not only that. The estate papers of Ashvale, 2 centuries of deeds and rentals and settlements and correspondence, had been left to moulder in the muniment room and the library presses since the death of the old Duke, and Mrs. Pruitt had conveyed, with the air of one passing on an absurdity, that the present Duke wished them catalogued, sorted, and made plain, and that a governess who read Latin and French and kept a fair hand was thought equal to the work between her hours with the young ward. So Eleanor sat at a long table by the eastern windows with the morning light on her hands, and she opened the first of the great calf-bound ledgers, and the smell of it rose to meet her, dust and old ink, and the particular sweetness of decaying leather, and she felt, as she always felt before a body of papers, the small private quickening of a mind given something worthy to do. She worked methodically. She made her piles and her lists. She noted the hands and the dates. She set the marriage settlements apart from the rent rolls and the rent rolls apart from the letters, and she wrote upon slips of paper in her small, even script. And the hours passed, and the light moved across the carpet and thinned and went grey, and a maid brought her a cup of tea grown cold before it reached her, and took it away again untouched. She learned the shape of the family from its papers, as one may learn a person from the things they keep. She learned that the Cavendishes had held Ashvale and its land since the reign of the first James, that they had married for money in the last century and for blood before it, that the eastern farmlands beyond the river had come to them late and uneasily, and that the old Duke, William's father, had been a man who wrote a great many letters and destroyed, she suspected, a great many more. There was a coldness in the papers that matched the coldness of the house. There was little of love in them, and a great deal of property. And once, lifting a bundle of rentals tied in faded tape, she came upon a portrait miniature that had slipped between the leaves, a young woman with fair hair and a soft, uncertain mouth, and she knew without being told that this was the late Duchess, the wife who had died, and she held it a moment in the morning light before she set it gently aside, for it was not hers to keep, and she had learned long ago not to touch the griefs of the houses she served. There was, too, a ledger of household accounts that drew her eye, and in it she read the slow shrinking of a great establishment. Fewer servants each year, the fires in the state-rooms left unlit, the wax candles given over for cheaper tallow, the hothouses let go cold, the second carriage sold. A house may starve as surely as a person, she thought, and this one had been starving by inches, not for want of money, for the rentals told of money enough, but for want of any living soul who cared whether it lived or died. She set the account book aside and made her note of it, and did not let herself dwell upon it, for it was not her place to grieve the griefs of strangers. The pile at her left grew through the afternoon, and the satisfaction of it was real. The plain, honest satisfaction of order made out of muddle, which had been, these 8 years, very nearly the whole of her comfort. She did not meet the Duke that day, nor the next. She heard him, sometimes, the closing of a distant door, a tread upon a far stair, the low single note of a man speaking to a dog. She heard the household speak of him in the careful lowered way servants speak of a master they fear and pity in equal measure, and she bent again over the ledgers, and the short day failed around her, and she told herself that it was nothing to her, the sorrow of this house, that she had come to catalogue its papers and teach its child and take her wages and go, and she very nearly believed it, sitting alone in the dying light, with the dust drifting gold in the last of the sun. She set the day's slips in order, squared the ledgers, and went up to her cold room, as the bell rang for the servants' supper she did not share. The ward was a child of 9 named Beatrice, the daughter of the Duke's late sister, an orphan twice over, with her uncle's dark gravity already settling upon a face that ought to have been merry. And on the 3rd morning Eleanor was brought to the schoolroom in the north wing to begin her proper office. The room was small and cold, with a globe gone yellow at the poles and a pianoforte that had not been tuned in living memory, and a window that looked out upon the frosted box hedges of the privy garden, where nothing now grew but the shapes of what had grown. Beatrice was wary, as orphans learn to be, and she sat very straight and answered in the fewest possible words, and watched Eleanor with the sidelong attention of a creature deciding whether to trust. Eleanor did not press her. She had taught a good many frightened children, and she knew that trust, like frost, could not be hurried. It formed in its own time, or not at all. So she opened a book of French fables and read aloud in her low, even voice, not asking the child to attend, only reading, as though for her own pleasure, the story of the fox and the crow, and presently she felt rather than saw the small dark head incline toward her, and when she came to the cheese falling from the foolish crow's open beak, a sound escaped Beatrice that was very nearly a laugh, quickly stifled, as though laughter too were a thing forbidden in this house. Eleanor read on as if she had not heard, but she marked it, and was glad, and she understood a little more of the cold she had walked into, for a house in which a child has learned to swallow her own laughter is a house that has forgotten something important about itself. She set the child to copying, and while the small head bent over the slate, with the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth, Eleanor looked about the cold schoolroom and read in it, as she had read the account book, the whole sad history of a neglected childhood, the worn primer that had served some earlier Cavendish, the sampler half-finished and abandoned upon the window-sill, the rocking horse in the corner with one ear gone, and its painted eye looking sidelong at the room, as though it too had learned to keep quiet. There had been a long succession of women who had not stayed, for the wages were good, but the house was hard, and a child raised among silence learns silence as her mother tongue. Eleanor had been such a child herself, the poor cousin in a house that fed her and clothed her, and never once asked what she thought. And she knew the particular loneliness of it, the loneliness that has no name and makes no complaint, because it has never known anything else to which to compare itself. She would not, she resolved, be another woman who did not stay. Or, if she must go in the end, as governesses always went in the end, she would at least leave the child a little less alone than she had found her. The morning passed in French and in the copying of letters, and at its end Beatrice, gathering her slate, said in a small rush, as though the words had been waiting, that her uncle did not like to be made noise near, that her uncle was sad always, that her mamma and her aunt had both gone to heaven, and her uncle had stopped speaking very much after, and that she, Beatrice, tried to be quiet so as not to trouble him. Eleanor knelt then, careful of her grey skirts on the cold boards, and looked the child levelly in the eye, and said that a person might be sad and still be glad of a little noise, that the two were not enemies, and that she, Miss Voss, was very fond indeed of the sound of a child reading aloud, however badly, and that Beatrice need never swallow her laughter on Eleanor's account. The child looked at her a long moment with those grave dark eyes weighing the words against everything the house had taught her, and then she nodded, once gravely, as one striking a bargain. It was a small thing. It was the smallest of things, a governess and a child and an agreement about laughter in a cold north room. But Eleanor carried it down to the morning room with her like a coal in a warming pan, and she found that the ledgers seemed a little less grey for it, and she worked through the afternoon with the unfamiliar lightness of a woman who has been, in some small, unlooked-for way, of use to another living soul. The dust drifted in the last of the light. Somewhere below a dog barked once and was still, and Eleanor, squaring her slips and capping her ink, did not yet know that the very papers warming under her careful hands held a thing that would ask far more of her than fables and kindness, and that the bargain she had struck that morning would not be the last she made in this house, nor the hardest. It was on the 9th day that she found it. The light was failing, and she had taken a branch of beeswax candles into the muniment room off the library to finish a press she had begun that morning, and the cold, there was a solid thing breathing up out of the stone floor, so that her breath hung white before her, and the candle flame stood very still in the dead air. She was working through a black tin deed box that had been pushed to the back of the lowest shelf, its lid stiff with disuse, and within it, beneath a layer of estate maps and a bundle of old game accounts, she came upon a single document folded thrice and sealed, the seal long broken, the paper stiff and yellowed at its folds. She opened it in the candlelight as she had opened 1,000 such papers, with no expectation in her at all, and she began to read, and the cold of the room seemed to enter her by another door entirely. It was a deed of conveyance, drawn in the careful, clerkly hand of a country attorney, dated in the spring of 1816, and it concerned the eastern farmlands beyond the river, the Bywater holdings, some 400 acres of good arable that had been farmed by the same family, the Hartleys, for 3 generations under a customary tenant right, that should, by every law of equity she knew, have ripened long since into something very near to ownership. But the deed before her told another story. It set out in the bloodless language of the law that the Bywater lands had been conveyed absolutely to the Ashvale estate, free of all claim, and it bore at its foot the signature of the old Duke, William's father, in a hand grown shaky and uncertain, and beside it in fresher ink 2 other signatures she did not know, and a date, and a place. And folded within it, as though tucked away in haste, was a second sheet, a letter, in the old Duke's own hand, that made plain what the deed concealed, that the customary right of the Hartleys was known to be good, that the family had been promised the freehold in the late Duke's lifetime, and that the conveyance had been pushed through in the failing months of his mind by persons who stood to gain against a family who could not read the law and could not pay to fight it. Eleanor sat very still in the cold. She read it again and a 3rd time, holding the candle close until the words admitted of no other meaning. She had witnessed 6 years before, in a quite different county and a quite different life, the signing of just such a paper in a sick room that smelt of camphor and decay, and she had been too young then, and too dependent to understand what she saw or to speak. And the memory of it rose in her now, whole and unwelcome, and she understood that she had walked all unknowing into the same wrong a second time, and that this time she was older and saw clearly, and could not plead that she had not understood. For she remembered with a vividness that the 6 intervening years had not dulled, the old gentleman propped on his pillows with his hand guided across the page by another, and the lawyer's smooth assurances, and the way the household had gone about afterward, with the particular brightness of people who have got what they wanted and mean not to think too closely about how. And she remembered most of all her own silence, the silence of a girl of 20 who had no money and no name and no one in the world to take her part, and who had told herself that to speak would be to lose her place, and had said nothing, and had watched a family turned out of what was theirs, and had carried the small cold weight of it in her ever since, into 3 houses and across half of England, never quite set down. She refolded the deed with hands that were not quite steady. She did not, she found, know what she meant to do. To carry such a thing to the Duke was to step entirely out of her allotted shape, to make herself seen, to risk the small, safe living she had pieced together. And the Duke was a cold man, and a grieving one, and what was the wrong of dead men to him, who would not even be troubled by the laughter of a child? She placed the document back within the tin box, beneath the maps, where she had found it, and she stood a long while in the muniment room with the candle guttering, her breath white before her, the house settling and ticking in the frost around her. Then she took up the branch of candles and went out and shut the cold door behind her, and carried the knowledge of it up to her room as one carries a stone in the breast. And she did not sleep that night, nor decide, but lay listening to the wind walk the corridors of Ashvale and wondering what a single woman, paid to be invisible, was made of, and whether it was enough. For 3 days she said nothing, and the not saying sat in her like a swallowed coal. She went about her work with her usual steadiness. She taught Beatrice her French verbs and the use of the globe. She catalogued the rent rolls and the marriage settlements. She ate her solitary meals and answered Mrs. Pruitt's grievances with a mildness that cost her something, and all the while the deed lay in its tin box at the back of the lowest shelf, and she felt the weight of it through the very floor, as though the house knew that she knew. She told herself the prudent things. She told herself that it was no concern of a governess, that the law was for the lawyers and the wrong for those with the means to right it, that a woman with £80 a year and no family to shelter her could not afford a conscience that drew the notice of dukes. She told herself that the Hartleys were strangers to her, that she had never seen the Bywater lands, that the world was full of quiet wrongs, and one woman could not carry them all, and every argument she made was sound, and not one of them let her sleep. For she had carried already, these 6 years, the memory of the other paper, the sick room, and the camphor, and her own young silence. And she had told herself then, too, that it was not her place, and she had watched a different family lose what was theirs, and she had learned that silence is not the same as innocence, that a thing seen and unspoken becomes, in time, a thing half done by the one who held her tongue. She did not wish to learn that lesson twice. She thought, in those 3 sleepless nights, of all the shapes her life might take if she spoke and was not believed, or was believed and dismissed. The cold walk to the carrier's cart with her one trunk, the letter of character refused, or, worse, given grudgingly with some small poison in it that would close every good door against her. The slow descent, which she had seen happen to better women than herself, from governess to companion to the workhouse gate. A woman alone in the world had nothing but her respectability and her usefulness, and both could be taken from her in a morning by anyone with rank enough to do it, and she knew this as she knew her own name. And yet she found, turning it over in the dark, that the fear of poverty, real as it was, had grown smaller in her than the other thing, the thing she could not name, but that woke her before the bell and would not let her be. The slow understanding that a person is not only what is done to them, but what they permit, and that she had permitted a wrong once already, and felt herself the less for it every day since, as though a small light in her had been turned down and never turned up again. So, on the fourth day, she did a thing that was, for her, an act of considerable courage. She walked to the Bywater Holdings. She told Mrs. Pruitt she wished to take the air, which was true, and she went out across the white moor in her dove-grey cloak, with the wind cutting at her 3 miles by the river path, until she came to the low stone farmhouse with its smoking chimney and its frozen yard, and she did not knock or speak to anyone, for she had no right to and no plan. But she stood a while at the gate in the cold, and looked at it. A woman came out to the well with 2 children at her skirts, a thin woman with a tired face who moved as though every joint pained her, and a boy of perhaps 7 broke the ice on the trough for the beasts, and a dog the colour of dirty snow rose stiffly from the doorstone and looked at Eleanor without barking, and over it all hung the particular silence of a household that has heard bad news and does not yet know how bad. Eleanor watched them a little while, then she turned and walked the 3 miles back with the wind now at her face, and by the time she came again under the leafless limes of the avenue, she had stopped telling herself the prudent things, for she had seen the faces now, and a wrong with a face to it is a different thing entirely from a wrong upon a page. She did not know how she would speak, or to whom, or what it would cost her. But she knew, climbing the cold stair with her cloak still damp from the moor, that she would speak, and the knowing settled in her, not as fear, but as a kind of grim relief, the relief of a creature that has stopped pretending it does not feel the trap upon its foot. She had thought it would be hard to come near the Duke, and so it proved, but not in the way she had imagined, for the chance of it came to her sideways, through the child. It was the library, late, a fortnight after her arrival, and Eleanor had gone down after Beatrice was abed to fetch a particular grammar she wanted for the morning, carrying her single candle through the sleeping-house, and she had not expected the long room to be lit, but it was, by a low fire and a branch of candles at the far end, and the Duke of Ashvale was there, in a great chair drawn up to the hearth, with a wolfhound, the colour of iron, lying across his feet, and an open book unread upon his knee. She stopped at the threshold. She had seen him only twice before, at a distance, a tall, spare figure in mourning black who did not look up. Now the firelight was full on his face, and she saw that he was younger than the household's fear of him had led her to think, perhaps 32, and that grief had not softened him, but pared him down, so that he had the look of something weathered to its grain. He turned his head and saw her in the doorway with her candle, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the dog lifted its grey head and considered her. She begged his pardon. She said she had come for a book, that she had thought the room empty, that she would withdraw. He looked at her a moment longer, and then he said, in a voice rusty with disuse, that she was the governess who read 4 languages and catalogued his father's papers, and that he had been told she was making sense of the muniment room. And was it true? She said it was, as far as the work was gone, And then, because the dog had risen and crossed to her and pushed its great rough head against her hand, and because she could not in courtesy ignore it, she stood a moment stroking the wiry coat between its ears, and the Duke watched her do it, and something in his face altered very slightly, as a frozen surface alters at the first thought of thaw. "The hound," he said, "did not go to people?" Eleanor said that perhaps it knew she had no one to go to either, and she had not meant to say it, and she was appalled the instant it left her, for it was far too near the bone and far above her station. But the Duke did not freeze, as she had braced for, only looked at her with a sudden startled attention, as though a piece of furniture had spoken sense, and then he looked away into the fire and said, very low, that the house was hard on those who came to it, with no one. She asked him, then, because the silence wanted filling and because the work was the only safe ground between them, whether he wished the catalogue ordered by date or by subject, for the muniment room could be made to answer either purpose, and he considered the question with a gravity out of all proportion to it, as a man considers any question put to him after a long while of no one asking him anything, and said that he would leave it to her judgment, that she plainly had more judgment in such matters than he, who had not opened the deed-boxes in 4 years, and had no wish to. There was a weariness in the way he said it that told her more than the words, and she understood that the papers were to him not a task but a tomb, the whole accumulated weight of his father and his father's father, and the cold bargaining lives of all the Cavendishes who had married for money and died for property, and that he had set her to catalogue them in part because he could not bear to touch them himself. She did not say so. She only nodded and said that she would order them by subject and date both, so that any matter might be found 2 ways, and he looked at her again with that small, startled attention, as though cents from a quarter he had not expected were a thing he had forgotten could happen. They spoke, a little after that, of the papers, of Beatrice and her French, of nothing that mattered, but it was speech, real speech, the first she had had in that house with another grown soul, and the fire burned down between them, and the wolfhound settled again with a sigh, and when at last she made her courtesy and withdrew with her grammar, she carried away with her the memory of his face turning toward her in the firelight, and the strange, unlooked-for fact that for the space of half an hour in the coldest house she had ever served in, she had not felt invisible at all. She told herself, climbing the stair, that it meant nothing, that he had merely been starved of company and she had happened to be there, and this too she very nearly believed, which by now she ought to have known was the surest sign that it was not true. After that night, the house was not quite the same to her, though nothing in it had visibly changed. The Duke did not seek her out, for that was not in his nature, but the doors between his solitude and the rest of the house stood, as it were, an inch ajar, and Eleanor found herself drawn through them by small, unremarkable degrees. He came once to the schoolroom on the pretext of a letter for Mrs. Pruitt, and stayed a quarter of an hour listening to Beatrice stumble through a fable, standing by the cold window, with his arms folded, and when the child reached the end and looked up half in terror for his judgment, he said only that her accent was better than his own had ever been, and Beatrice flushed with a pleasure so total it was painful to see, and Eleanor understood that the man did not know how to be kind, and was learning it clumsily, late, like a language taken up in middle life. He took to walking the long gallery in the mornings when she carried her slips between the library and the morning room, and they fell, without either of them quite intending it, into the habit of exchanging a few words by the tall north windows where the light came grey off the snow. He spoke of his father, once obliquely, of a man hard to please and harder to mourn. She spoke, more guardedly, of the work of the papers, of the orderliness she was making out of 2 centuries of muddle. He was clever, she found, far cleverer than the household's pity allowed, and starved of any talk that did not skirt his grief, and she was careful, so careful, never to presume, never to step beyond the line that ran between them, the line that was made of his title and her wages and the whole great weight of the world's arrangement. And yet the line, she noticed, was something they now stood on either side of together, rather than a wall she stood behind alone. And the difficulty of it grew in her daily, for each small, honest exchange by the north windows made the deed in the tin box weigh the heavier, since to speak of it now was not merely to disturb a stranger's peace, but to repay this fragile new regard with a blow aimed at the memory of his own father, and she did not know how a man so newly come back from the country of his grief would bear such a thing, nor whether the small thawing she had watched in him would survive it, nor, if she were wholly honest with herself in the cold of her own room at night, whether she could bear to be the one to put it out. She told herself that this was cowardice dressed in the clothes of kindness, and she was very likely right, and it did not make the telling any easier. One grey morning he found her at the window with frost flowers thick on the glass beside her, and he asked, abruptly, whether she was happy in her work, and she was so unused to being asked anything of the kind that she answered him truly, which was that she was happy when she was useful, and that she had been useful here, with Beatrice, and with the papers, more than in any house these 8 years. He looked at her then, with that startled attention she had surprised in him by the fire, and he said that she spoke of usefulness as though it were the whole of what a person might want, and she answered that for a woman in her position it very nearly was, and that she had learned not to want past her means. He was silent at that a moment. Then he said, looking out at the white moor and not at her, that he thought she undervalued herself, and that he had been 4 years in the company of his own grief, and had grown to know the look of a person who had taught themselves to expect little, and that she wore it as he did. It was the most either of them had said. She did not answer, for there was no answer that did not say too much, and after a moment he bowed, very slightly, the bow one gives an equal and not a servant, and walked on down the gallery with his hands behind his back, and Eleanor stood among the frost flowers with her slips of paper in her hand and her heart doing something it had no business to do, and she thought of the tin box in the muniment room, and of the thing she had resolved to tell him, and she understood with a sinking that grew daily harder to ignore that it had become, for reasons she did not care to name, far more difficult to tell him now than it would have been a fortnight since. Lady Cordelia Finch arrived at Ashvale Court in the last week of January, in a travelling chariot with a crest upon the door, and 4 matched greys steaming in the cold, and the house, which had slept for 4 years, woke to receive her in a flurry of fires lit in long cold grates, and covers struck from forgotten furniture, and Mrs. Pruitt in a state of grievance so exalted it approached joy. She came at the Dowager Duchess's summons, Lady Margaret having descended upon her son's house a few days before her, and the purpose of the visit was understood by every soul beneath the roof within the hour of its beginning, for the Dowager made no secret of it. It was time, past time, that the Duke should marry again, that Ashvale should have a mistress and an heir, that the long unwholesome mourning should be put off like a worn coat, and Lady Cordelia, 24, golden-haired, accomplished, and of impeccable family, was the remedy her ladyship had selected. Eleanor saw her first across the great hall, and felt, in the same instant, the full distance of her own station restored to her, as a door restored to its frame. Lady Cordelia was beautiful in the bright, hard way of a woman who has never once doubted her welcome anywhere. She wore a pelisse of moss-green velvet trimmed with sable, and she moved through the cold, shabby grandeur of Ashvale as though appraising it for purchase, and when her glance fell upon Eleanor in her turned grey wool, it passed over her and through her, and away in the single practised motion by which the great learn not to see the people who serve them. Eleanor was not wounded by it. She had been unseen by better than Lady Cordelia, but she watched, for she had learned to watch, and she did not like what she saw. For Lady Cordelia, settling into the house, took an interest in its papers that a beautiful young woman bent only on a marriage had no reason to take. She asked Mrs. Pruitt idly who it was that catalogued the muniment room, and how far the work was advanced, and whether the old Duke's private papers were among them. And these questions, relayed to Eleanor over the housekeeper's tea, with no understanding of their weight, fell into her like stones into a still pool. For there was, in the days that followed, a quality to Lady Cordelia's interest that no amount of idle accomplishment could account for. She came to the morning-room one afternoon while Eleanor worked, on the pretext of seeking a book, and lingered by the long table where the sorted papers lay in their docketed bundles, and her gloved hand moved over them, with a lightness that was not idle at all, and she asked, in a voice of perfect carelessness, where the conveyances were kept, and whether the old Duke's last years were well documented, and whether Miss Voss had found the records of the estate complete, or whether there were gaps. Eleanor answered each question with the flat, truthful brevity of a servant who has learned that the less one says the safer one is, and gave nothing away, and watched the beautiful face for the flicker that would tell her what was sought. And she saw at once a small tightening about the bright eyes when she said that the eastern farmland records were among those she had not yet reached, a tightening swiftly smoothed away. It is a singular thing, Eleanor thought afterward, that a person bent on concealment so often betrays the very thing they would hide by the care they take to seem careless of it. She began to watch Lady Cordelia more closely after that, and once, passing the morning-room where she had no business to be, she heard the Dowager and Lady Cordelia speak together in lowered voices, and she caught, before she withdrew, the words Bywater and Hartley, and the phrase let the matter lie, and a small cold certainty formed in her that the beautiful woman in the moss-green velvet knew of the wrong in the tin box, and was not troubled by it, and meant it to stay buried. That evening, Lady Cordelia, finding Eleanor in the gallery with Beatrice, sent the child off to her supper with a careless wave, and looked at Eleanor a long bright moment, and remarked, smiling, that it was a curious thing to set a governess to lawyers' work, that papers were delicate matters and easily misread by those without the breeding to understand them, and that she was sure Miss Voss would be wise to confine herself to the schoolroom, where her undoubted talents would be of more proper use. It was gently said, and it was a threat, and both women knew it. Eleanor curtsied and said that she understood, and went up to her cold room. But she did not, this time, feel the old lowering of the spirit. She felt, instead, the trap upon her foot draw tight, and something in her that she had kept folded small for a great many years begin, very quietly, to unfold. She chose her moment with care, for she would have but one. The household was at church on the Sunday, the Dowager and Lady Cordelia gone down in the chariot to the village to be seen, and the Duke, who had not entered a church since his wife was carried out of one, kept to the house as was his custom, and Eleanor, who had pleaded a headache to be left behind, went first to the muniment room and took the deed and the folded letter from the tin box, and then she went to the library where she knew she would find him, with the papers held flat against her like a breastplate, and her heart going hard. He was at the window with the wolfhound, and he turned when she came in, and something in her face stopped whatever courtesy he had been about to offer. She did not sit. She said, in her low, careful voice, that she had found a thing among his father's papers that she could not in conscience keep from him, and that she begged him to hear her out before he sent her away, for she expected to be sent away, and she would go quietly. But she would not go with this unsaid a second time in her life. And then, before her courage could fail or his coldness gather, she laid the deed upon the table between them, and the letter beside it, and she told him plainly what they were: the wrongful conveyance of the Bywater lands, signed by his father in the failing of his mind, the customary right of the Hartleys overridden, the freehold promised and then taken, the whole quiet legal theft of a family's living, and the second hand at work in it, that meant to keep the matter buried still. She watched his face as she spoke and saw it close, and then, as he took up the letter and read his father's own words, saw it change in a way she had not foreseen, not to the anger she had braced for, but to a kind of grey stillness, the stillness of a man who has been handed the last piece of a thing he had refused for years to look at whole. She saw the cost of it pass across him as he read, for it is no small thing to be handed the proof that the father one has spent 4 years half mourning and half resenting was, at the last, a party to the robbing of the helpless. And she saw, too, that some part of him had known, or half known, all along, and had refused the knowing, and that what she had truly done was not to tell him a thing he did not know, but to make it impossible for him any longer not to know it. That, she understood, was the real trespass and the real gift, and they were the same act. He did not rage as a lesser man might, nor seek to explain it away, nor turn the blame upon her for the bringing of it, all of which she had braced herself against in the long, sleepless nights. He only grew very still, and read his father's words a second time, his jaw set hard, the firelight moving on the planes of his face, the wolfhound watching him with the grave attention of a creature that knows its master's moods better than the master knows them himself. He read it twice. He set it down. He asked her, very quietly, how long she had known, and she told him, 9 days, less than a fortnight, and that she had walked to the Bywater holdings and seen the family, the thin woman and the children and the dog, and that she had not been able to leave it lie, though she had tried, though she had told herself every prudent thing, because she had once before been silent over just such a paper, and had learned what silence makes of a person. He looked at her a long moment then, the letter in his hand, the firelight on the hard, pared planes of his face, and he said that most people in her place would have stayed silent and kept their living, and that she had risked hers to bring him a wrong that was his family's shame, and not her burden at all, and he asked her, almost roughly, why? And Eleanor, who had spent 8 years learning to want past nothing and to keep her own counsel, and to wear her cleverness beneath notice, found that she had no careful answer left in her, and she said only that some things were true, whether or not it was safe to say them, and that she had grown tired of being the kind of person who let true things lie. The fire settled, the hound sighed against the hearth, and the Duke of Ashvale stood looking at the plain grave Governess in her turned grey gown, as though he were seeing, for the first time in 4 cold years, something he had thought the world no longer contained. He did not, as she had half feared and half hoped, act in haste. He was a deliberate man, made more so by grief, and the wrong before him was an old one with deep roots, and so for 3 days he said little and did much, and Eleanor watched the house change around her, as a man long becalmed takes up the oars. He sent, quietly, for the family attorney from Newcastle, a dry, careful Mr. Pringle, who came up through the snow and was closeted with the Duke a whole afternoon over the deed and the letter, and the attorney confirmed what Eleanor had read in it, that the conveyance was void in equity if not at law, that the Hartleys' customary right was good, that the second signatures upon the deed belonged to men who had since prospered curiously, and that the thing could be set right, with resolve, though not without scandal touching the old Duke's name. The Duke heard this, and did not flinch from the scandal, which Eleanor marked for a fortnight, since she did not think he would have stirred himself to save his own name, let alone risk it for strangers across the river. In those 3 days Eleanor saw him changed, or rather saw the man he might have been before grief closed over him begin to surface again, as a drowned field surfaces when the flood at last goes down. He gave orders, and they were obeyed. Fires were lit in rooms long cold, and the agent was summoned, and old accounts were called for, and the household, which had moved for 4 years at the slow, muffled pace of a house in perpetual mourning, woke to the unfamiliar sensation of a master who wished things done and done quickly. Eleanor kept to her work and her schoolroom and said nothing of her part, for she wished none, and she was careful as ever to make herself small, but she could not always keep from her mind the thought that she had set all this in motion, that the single sheet she had carried up from the cold muniment room had begun to thaw something far larger than itself, and the thought frightened her a little and steadied her more, for whatever came of it, she had at last done the thing she had failed to do 6 years before, and the small turned-down light in her burned, she found, a little brighter for it. But the harder confrontation was not with the law, and he knew it, and on the 4th day he sought out his mother. Eleanor was not present, and would not have presumed to be, but the house was old and its doors were thin, and the raised voice of the Dowager Duchess carried where her lowered one had not, and the household learned, in the way households learn everything, that there had been a reckoning in the morning-room, for Lady Margaret had known. That was the thing that came clear in the days that followed, pieced from the air of the house and from what little the Duke himself let fall, that his mother had known of the Bywater fraud these 6 years, that she had thought it a small necessary tidiness in the estate's favour, that she had brought Lady Cordelia North in part because Lady Cordelia's family had an interest, through one of those prospering signatories in the matter staying buried, and that the marriage her ladyship had designed was to have sealed the silence as much as the succession. The Duke confronted her with all of it, the deed, the letter, the attorney's opinion, and his mother met him with the cold astonishment of a woman who has never once been opposed by her son, and told him that he was throwing over his family's honour and his own future for the scruple of a governess, that he was a fool grown sentimental, that the girl had bewitched him with her plainness and her piety. And the Duke, Eleanor was given to understand, had answered his mother very quietly, as he did all things, that the governess had shown him more honour in a fortnight than his family had kept in a generation, and that he would have the Bywater lands restored to the Hartleys before the spring, and that those who could not abide it might find the roads south open and the weather, for the season as good as it would be. What the dowager answered to that was not given to the household to know, for after it her ladyship kept to her rooms and would see no one, and her trays went up and came down scarcely touched, and the great house, which had so lately woken to its master's will, settled into a new and watchful quiet, the quiet not of grief now, but of a quarrel that has cut to the bone and cannot be unsaid. The house held its breath. The frost stayed on the eastern windows, and Eleanor, going about her work with her eyes lowered, understood that something in the long frozen heart of Ashvale had cracked at last, and that the breaking of it would not be quiet, and would not leave her, whatever came, untouched. Lady Cordelia Finch did not stay to see the spring. She was too clever a woman to remain where the game was lost, and within the week of the reckoning in the morning room, her chariot was at the door again, with the 4 greys steaming, and her trunks brought down, and the brief cold blaze of her presence put out of the house as abruptly as it had been lit. She took her leave of the Duke in the great hall with perfect composure, for her kind did not weep over a marriage that was only ever a transaction, and she made him a curtsy of flawless correctness, and wished him joy of his scruples. And then, crossing to the foot of the stair, where Eleanor stood with Beatrice's hand in hers, she paused and looked at the governess with those bright, hard eyes, and the 2 women understood one another wholly in that moment, as they had from the first. Lady Cordelia said, low, so the child should not hear, that Miss Voss had played a deep game for a woman of no family, and that she hoped it would answer, and that she had observed in her travels that gentlemen grew weary of their consciences in time, and of the plain women who pricked them. It was a parting shaft, and meant to lodge, and Eleanor felt it go in. But she had been some weeks now learning not to flinch, and she met the bright gaze levelly and said that she had not played any game at all, that she had only declined to keep a wrong secret, and that whatever weariness might come, she would rather be the woman who had spoken than the one who had smiled and let it lie. For a moment, something almost like respect crossed the beautiful face, the involuntary respect of one duellist for another who has stood her ground, and then it was gone, smoothed over with the practised composure that was Lady Cordelia's truest accomplishment, and she said only that Miss Voss would learn, in time, that the world was not made for women who declined to keep wrongs secret, and that she wished her the joy of her honesty and the cold comfort it would bring her. It was a wish meant to wound, and a graceful one, for there was just enough truth in it to lodge. The world was indeed not made for such women, and Eleanor knew it better than Lady Cordelia ever could. But she had crossed, these past weeks, into a country where she could hear such a thing and let it pass through her without taking root, and she made the lady a curtsy of exact and unhurried correctness, neither too low nor too high, the curtsy of a woman who knows precisely what she is and is no longer ashamed of it, and she said that she thanked her ladyship for her good wishes and would remember them. Lady Cordelia's smile thinned. She gathered her sable about her and went out to her chariot, and the door of Ashvale closed behind her, and the household, listening from its shadows, let out a breath it had held since January. Beatrice, who had understood little of it but the chill, looked up at Eleanor and asked whether the pretty lady was gone for good, and Eleanor said that she believed she was, and the child considered this and said that she was glad, because the pretty lady had not liked the wolfhound, and a person who did not like the wolfhound was not, Beatrice felt, to be trusted. Eleanor laughed at that, truly, the first true laugh she could remember in that house, and the sound of it went up into the cold rafters of the hall where laughter had been so long forbidden, and Beatrice, delighted to have caused it, laughed too, and the two sounds together, the woman's low and the child's high, rang in that great grim space as though they were the first warm thing it had heard in years, and did not quite know what to make of. From the gallery above, unseen, the Duke had paused at the head of the stair at the sound, and stood a moment with his hand upon the cold rail, listening, before he went quietly on. But neither of them knew that yet. The Dowager Duchess had withdrawn to her own dower house in the south some days before, in a silence more eloquent than any quarrel, and so the great hall held only the governess and the child and the iron-grey hound that came now and pressed its head against Eleanor's hand, as though it too had chosen its side. And for a moment the three of them stood in the grey light of the closing afternoon, and the house around them seemed less like a thing dying than a thing that had survived a long illness and was not yet sure it dared to mend. The Bywater lands were restored to the Hartleys upon a morning in early March, when the snow had begun at last to give, and the river ran high and brown between its banks. The Duke went down himself, which was a thing his father would never have done, and the household could scarcely credit, and he took Eleanor with him, for she had asked, with an old caution that was slow to leave her, whether she might see it finished, and he had said that it would not be finished without her, and that she had better come. They went on horseback by the river path, the dry attorney Mr. Pringle following in the gig, with the engrossed deed of restoration in his case, and Eleanor in her dove-grey habit rode beside the Duke through a world that was learning, tentatively, how to drip and thaw and run. The snow lay yet in the hollows and along the north sides of the walls, grey and granular and giving up its hold, but the river was loud with it, and there was a smell in the air she had not smelt since November, the dark, wet smell of earth remembering itself, and somewhere out across the moor a curlew called, the first she had heard, its long bubbling note the very sound of a season turning. She thought of the first day she had come up the frozen avenue, half perished in the carriage, and of how far she had travelled since, though the distance could not be measured in any of her 4 languages. She had come to this country, a woman resolved to want nothing and to be of use, and to take her wages and go, and she rode now beside a duke through a thawing land on an errand of plain justice that she herself had set in motion, and she did not know what was to become of her when the papers were catalogued and the work was done, and for the first time in 8 years she found that the not knowing did not frighten her, that she could bear an open future as she had borne so many closed ones. At the low stone farmhouse the thin woman came out, the same who had drawn water at the well that bitter day, and the children, and the dog the colour of dirty snow. And the Duke, who did not know how to make a speech and did not attempt one, said plainly to the gathered family that a wrong had been done them by his house and was now undone, that the Bywater freehold was theirs and their children's after them, free of all claim, and he gave the deed into the farmer's roughened hands, and would hear no thanks, only turned the talk at once to the state of the drains and the prospect of the lambing, as though afraid of what gratitude might do to him. The farmer himself, a broad, slow man with the weather of 40 winters in his face, stood holding the deed in hands that did not seem to know what to do with so light and so heavy a thing, and turned it over once, and looked at the Duke as though waiting still for the catch in it, the codicil, the cruel reversal that the great had always, in his experience, kept in reserve. And finding none, finding only the plain fact of the land made theirs again, he said nothing at all, for there were no words in him fitted to the occasion, and only took off his hat slowly, and held it against his chest, and bowed his grey head over the paper a long moment in a silence more eloquent than any speech. But Eleanor saw the thin woman's face, and saw what 6 years of dread going out of it looked like, the slow, incredulous easing of a person who has carried a stone so long they have forgotten the shape of standing without it. And the woman crossed to Eleanor, who sat a little apart on her horse, and looked up at her and said, simply, that she did not know what part the lady had played, but that she knew, somehow, that there had been a part, and she thanked her, and reached up and pressed Eleanor's gloved hand in both her own chapped ones. And Eleanor, who had been thanked very little in her life, and never for a thing that mattered, found that her eyes had filled, and she was glad of the cold wind to account for it, and she pressed the woman's hand in return, and could not for a moment speak. They rode back as the light went gold over the wet moor, and neither said much, and there was no need. Spring came to Ashvale Court slowly, as all things came to it, but it came. The frost loosed its hold upon the eastern windows, and the box hedges of the privy garden put out their small dark green, and one morning Eleanor heard, from the schoolroom where Beatrice was conjugating French verbs with something almost like delight, the unfamiliar sound of a window being opened to let the soft air in, and she understood that the house had begun, at long last, to breathe. It was in the library that he asked her, where so much between them had begun, on an afternoon when the light came through the tall windows, no longer grey, but pale and living, and the wolfhound lay stretched in a patch of it as though it had never known cold. The Duke stood by the hearth, and Eleanor by the table where she had laid the deed before him that Sunday, and he said, without his usual deliberation, almost quickly, as a man says a thing he fears he will not say at all if he weighs it, that the papers were near catalogued and Beatrice near fitted for a proper school, and that by every reasonable measure her work at Ashvale was done, and that he found, having framed the matter so to himself a dozen times, that he could not bear the reasonable measure, and that he was asking her to stay, not as governess, not as a useful shape in the background of his house, but as its mistress and his wife, if she would have a cold, awkward man some years out of practice at being glad of anything. Eleanor stood very still. She had taught herself for so long to want past nothing, that the wanting, now it was allowed, near unsteadied her, the way a long-shuttered room is near overwhelmed by the first opening of its windows. She thought of all the reasons it could not be, and they were many, and they were real. The difference in their stations, which the world would never forgive and never let them forget. The memory of the fair-haired wife whose miniature she had set so gently aside on her first morning in this house, her own plainness and her poverty, and the long habit of expecting nothing, which is the hardest habit of all to break, harder than any vice, for it has worn its grooves into the very soul. She had spent a lifetime learning to be content with the crumb and to call the wanting of the loaf a kind of greed. And here was the loaf held out to her, plainly, by a man who meant it, and the old, trained part of her flinched from it as from a thing too good to be safe. She said that she was plain and of no family, and that the world would say he had thrown himself away. He said that the world had been wrong about a great many things under that roof, and might as well be wrong about one more, and that as for family, a woman who would risk her bread for the sake of strangers across a river had more of nobility in her than he had met in any drawing-room in his life, and that the only name he wished her to take was his own. He said that he had spent 4 years among people who saw nothing, and one winter beside a woman who saw everything, the wrong in the deed box, and the loneliness in a child, and the loneliness in himself that he had not known showed, and that he knew which of those he meant to spend the rest of his life beside. And Eleanor Voss, 26 years of age, in her turned grey wool, who had come up the frozen avenue an invisible woman, and meant only to take her wages and go, looked at him across the room, where the spring light lay warm upon the floor, and found that the careful folded thing in her had unfolded all the way at last, and she said yes. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the long avenue of limes was putting out its first pale leaves, and the house, which had forgotten so long how to be warm, stood in the gentle light and remembered.